What is the difference between a tool watch, a sport watch, and a dress watch? Let's talk about it.
I got the cash in the bag, stadium packed. Born a rock star in this life, gonna live it up on the attack. Baby, I'm bad, I just wanna get caught up in this life. I'm crazy, I'm mad, doing no cap. Only got one, so you better go live it up. Cash in the bag, stadium packed. Baby, I'm bad, yeah. Baby, I'm bad.
I just wanna stay bad, stay mad. Chip on my shoulder cause they treat me like an outcast. I ain't gonna take that, stay back. I'll be swinging hard till the hits come in all caps. I ain't gonna lay back, pray that someone's gonna help me. Ain't nobody like that. I ain't gonna wait, that's all fact. Give me one shot and I'll never get the throne.
So when it comes to watch collecting, there seems to be some controversy or maybe disagreement or misunderstanding about the difference between tool watches, sport watches, and dress watches. I mean, if you think about our understanding of chemistry or of the animal kingdom, how much time have humans spent just on the categorization of those things? And when we do spend a little bit of time understanding the classifications or categorizations of things, I think it helps us to be more informed and have just better, more thoughtful discussion about it. Also, when you have a good idea of the different categories, I think it makes a comparison a little bit easier. So I think it is worth our time to discuss the different categories of watches if we want to be better collectors or have a more well-rounded collection. So when it comes to watch collecting, I think all watches can fall into three major categories: a tool watch, a sport watch, and a dress watch. So when it comes to the tool watch category, I think form follows function. Every tool watch was made for a specific purpose, and so for a watch to be considered a tool watch, I think it has to be able to fulfill the function for which the watch was designed. Most tool watches are going to be made out of something like a steel, a stainless steel, steel alloy, titanium, those industrial type materials. And you might even see some tool watches made out of things like polymers or plastics for specific use cases. Now within that tool watch category, I think you have several different types of watches. The first watch that I would put in that tool watch category would be the battery powered beater. So watches like a G-Shock, a Casio F91W, something from Garmin, maybe a smartwatch, right? An Apple Watch. Now there's a lot of people within the watch collecting community that doesn't believe that an Apple Watch should actually fit in as a watch in a quote-unquote watch collection. But for me personally, I would say that an Apple Watch or a smartwatch is a piece of tech, but it would properly fit in the tool watch category, specifically as a battery-powered beater. So I would most closely associate Apple Watches to something like a G-Shock or a Garmin or another smartwatch. Now these watches tend to be inexpensive, tend to have high functionality, but they also tend to be battery powered, and so they might not last nearly as long as a traditional manual wound or automatic watch. Now one thing you guys gotta recognize is that your battery powered beater is not a formal watch. Please stop wearing your battery powered beaters with your suit. Yes, I understand American President Bill Clinton famously wore a Timex Ironman with his suits. But let's be fair, he was a politician, he was pandering for votes. That doesn't mean that it looked good. So if you're not running for political office and pandering to the public, please stop wearing your battery-operated beaters with formal attire. You have to know the rules of fashion if you're gonna break them. Now, after the battery-powered beater, the next tool watch I want to talk about is the dive watch. Now, to be considered a dive watch, it should meet the ISO standards for dive watches. So with dive watches, you really need to have a high level of water resistance, at least 100 meters, but most dive watches today are considerably higher. Dive watches will oftentimes have a screw-down crown, and they will generally have large lume plots that glow bright underwater. So dive watches should be highly legible in dark environments with generous amounts of lume applied. Dive watches also need a function to be able to time elapsed time. So for most dive watches, you're gonna see a unidirectional bezel. That way they know how long they've been submerged underwater, and so maybe they'll have a rough estimation of how much oxygen they have left for their dive. So dive watches need a crystal, a caseback, and gasket system that can withstand the pressures of diving. And ISO standards also require that dive watches have a certain amount of shock resistance. So dive watches are also going to be made out of a stainless type material. So you'll oftentimes see stainless steel, some type of an alloy that can resist rust and tarnishing. And more recently, we're starting to see more dive watches made out of titanium, which also doesn't rust. So the next tool watch I want to talk about is the pilot's watch. The first aviators in the 20th century started off using pocket watches, but obviously that's inefficient to be pulling out a pocket watch if you're mid-flight. These early pilots and aviators oftentimes were in exposed cockpits, so they're fighting turbulence and sometimes weather exposure. You'll oftentimes see high contrast dials between the dial, the hour set, and the handset, so that a pilot's able to look down at their watch and be able to read the time at a glance. For reasons of high visibility, you'll also oftentimes see pilots' watches being a little bit on the large side. Now, in order for a pilot to take their aircraft over the poles, their watch should have a fair amount of resistance to magnetism. So a critical feature of a pilot's watch would be that they are anti-magnetic, and because sometimes planes hit turbulence or they're changing elevation rather quickly, you would want a crystal that is able to withstand sudden atmospheric pressure changes. Another feature you'll oftentimes see on pilots' watches is a large crown, because pilots that are wearing gloves might want to be able to change the time or use the functionality of the watch while wearing gloves. So you'll see these large, pronounced onion-style crowns. Now, the next type of tool watch we're going to talk about is the racing chronograph. Now, racing chronographs really cut their teeth on the automobile tracks. So racing chronographs will generally be able to tell you the time, and then on the dial you will have a series of 2, maybe 3 subdials that helps the wearer to measure the exact passage of hours, minutes, and seconds. Oftentimes on the outer bezel of a racing chronograph, you're going to see a tachymeter scale. The reason why this is important is if you are able to time the exact number of seconds and you know the distance traveled, you're able to calculate the speed. And so this would be a highly functional tool for people that are out at the racetrack and are trying to time lapse. So racing chronographs can have kind of busier dials, and so you might not have as large of lume plots or large Arabic numerals taking up dial space. You'll oftentimes see simpler dials with maybe just stick indices and maybe even just pencil style hands so that it doesn't crowd the dial too much. Now, with a racing chronograph, water resistance is not as big of an issue as it is with something like a dive watch. Now, the next kind of tool watch we're going to talk about is the field watch. So field watches really cut their teeth on the battlefield of the 20th century. Some key components of a field watch is it should be thin to be able to slide under layers or under a uniform, under a shirt. A field watch should have a certain level of shock resistance, but they don't need as much water resistance as, let's say, a dive watch. Field watches should be simple to read, and you also don't want a field watch to be too bulky because of all of the manual labor or combat that you might be doing in the field. When I wear a field watch, it's usually for things like exploring or hiking, and I don't want my field watches to be too bulky. And with field watches, you don't need a really large crown because you want to be able to fully articulate your risk without having any issues. And because field watches were simpler and used less materials, I think they're also a little bit more affordable for a government or a military to be able to manufacture and supply them. Field watches will generally have a little bit of lume, but not nearly as much lume as, let's say, a dive watch. So there are a couple caveats that I do want to kind of touch on. Number one, the complication is not synonymous with the classification of watch. Oftentimes I'll hear watch collectors compare GMTs together or chronographs together and see it as like, oh, GMT watches and chronograph, they kind of classify them together. And I think that that's somewhat of a mistake. For example, you can have a racing chronograph, which is designed for a specific purpose. At the same time, there are watches that are maybe pilot's watches that I would consider chronographs. The Breitling Navitimer, for example. There's even watch companies that make what I would call a dress chronograph. Companies like IWC or Patek Philippe. And so just because a watch is a chronograph doesn't necessarily mean that it is a tool watch or a sport watch. Another example of complications not being synonymous with classifications of watches. For many years, Rolex used a GMT movement in both their GMT Master 2 and their Rolex Explorer 2 lines. Now, in both of these lines of watches, they used a GMT complication, but I'd say that the Explorer 2 is clearly a field watch, whereas the GMT Master 2 was designed to be a pilot's watch. So both watches using a GMT movement, but had very different philosophies of use behind them. So in my opinion, the complication is not synonymous with the classification of watches. I would see it as 2 separate layers. You have the classification of watch, and then the complication is like another layer on top of that. So I would say those are the 5 major subcategories of tool watches: the battery-powered beater, the dive watch, the field watch, the aviation watch, and the racing chronograph. Now, the next classification of watches I want to talk about is the sport watch. And where I think the sport watch falls into the collection is a sport watch is more elegant than a tool watch, but more robust than a dress watch. It kind of sits in between those two categories. Now, sport watches have more of a blend of form and function. A lot of sport watches will come on a bracelet, and I think when you start introducing precious metals or semi-precious metals, I think you are no longer in the tool watch category and you would fall into that sport watch category. So one way to differentiate between sport watches and tool watches is the presence of precious metal on the case or band of the watch. In my opinion, I think once a watch manufacturer starts putting precious metal on their bracelet or case, it oftentimes excludes that watch from being used as a tool watch. Think about it this way. When Rolex puts gold on their Submariner, I don't know of any scuba instructor or an avid scuba diver that's now going to take that watch diving. Or when Rolex put gold on their Rolex Explorer line, right? The Rolex Explorer was made to be a field watch, but you wouldn't put gold on a field watch. Gold is unnecessarily heavy and considerably softer than what you would need in a field watch. So it really doesn't make sense to put gold on a field watch if you're going to be considering it a tool watch. Having the presence of gold certainly makes the watch seem a little bit more elegant, a little bit more flashy. And so going back to that idea of a sport watch being more elegant than a tool watch, I kind of see the presence of gold as one indicator that moves a watch from being a real tool watch to being in that sport watch category. Now, sport watches need to be more robust than a dress watch, so you will sometimes see higher levels of water resistance as compared to a dress watch. So I think cost actually does come into play when you're differentiating between a tool watch and a sport watch. Because when we look back to the golden era of tool watches, I think of like the 1950s, right? The Rolex Submariner. Back in the 1950s, a soldier with a few years on could make $150 wages for the month. They could go down to a military store and buy a Rolex Submariner in the late 50s for $150. I kind of think that's where this concept of spending a whole month's wages on your watch probably kind of came from. In the late 50s and 60s, you could also go to those same military stores and buy a Zodiac Seawolf for $75. So even in the 50s, Rolex demanded a premium, but I think that $150 price point still put them squarely in that tool watch category. Now with inflation, that $150 in today's money would be worth closer to $1,500. And likewise, that same soldier's pay in today's dollars, at least in the US, would be closer to $3,000. But the Rolex Submariner has certainly moved up market with a new MSRP of closer to $9,000. And likewise, I know a lot of people that enjoy scuba diving, and I'm even friends with some commercial divers, and I'll tell you this, none of them wear a Rolex Submariner to dive anymore. And so sometimes I think that some of the Rolex pieces are miscategorized as tool watches. I think, to be fair, Rolex has probably moved up market to where many of their professional models, I would actually consider them to be sport watches and no longer really in this tool watch category. I personally own a Rolex Submariner, and if I'm being honest, when I'm going on a day out at the ocean or to do swimming, I usually don't bring my Rolex. I bring something like a Tudor or an Omega Seamaster for most of those endeavors. So some of the pieces in this sport watch category I would consider to be more of a tool watch inspired sport watch than a tool watch itself. Now that we have talked about tool watches and sport watches, the last category I want to touch on is the dress watch. Now with a dress watch, function follows form. A dress watch should be elegant. It doesn't need to be very complicated. It can have a very simple and uncluttered dial. With dress watches, you don't need a high level of water resistance. Oftentimes you'll see dress watches only having 30 meters of water resistance, which means you can wash your hands while wearing the watch, but that's about it. You're going to be taking off your dress watch if you're going to be participating in any kind of sport. A traditional dress watch should have a leather type strap, and a dress watch doesn't need to have any loom at all. Now, modern day dress watches sometimes will have some complications on them, but traditional dress watches were very simple time-only pieces. But I don't think it's wrong if you have a dress watch that has something like a moon phase on it. I think that can actually look pretty elegant. Dress watches will oftentimes have traditional dials. Things like Roman numerals, I think, look great on a dress watch. Some dress watches will have dates, but I also don't think that that's necessary. And it's also not uncommon for dress watches to not even have seconds hands. Some traditionalists would even say that for formal or black tie events, you shouldn't even wear a watch because it's rude to be considering the passage of time when you're at someone's event. And so to be fair, a dress watch doesn't even really need to have a second hand. Dress watches will oftentimes have high levels of polishing, whether that's a polished steel, and then a lot of dress watches are also made of precious metal. Gold, platinum, silver, some of those softer, more elegant metals, I think work perfectly on a dress watch. So if I was to pair a brand with each one of these categories, I would say like the Tudor Black Bay makes a perfect tool watch. A lot of the Rolex models would be a really good example of sport watches. And then a lot of the Cartier watches would be dress watches. So there you have my categorizations about the different classifications of watches. When it comes to tool watches, form follows function. Tool watches are purpose-built for specific reasons. With dress watches, function follows form. Elegance matters more than functionality. And then when it comes to sport watches, they are going to be more robust than a dress watch, yet more elegant than a tool watch. So if you've made it this far into the video and you found some value in this, go ahead and drop me a like. If you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button. And let me know in the comments down below if you strongly agree or disagree with these different watch categories. And remember guys, it might be a fashion faux pas to wear your Apple Watch with a sport coat, but at least you're wearing your watches.
Cash in the bag, stadium packed. Born a rock star in this life, gone live it up on